I'm Fatheree,
This is Dave.
and this is Tex-Trek.
Engage.
Welcome back aboard the Starship Texas for the 137th installment of the Tex-Trek podcast, the home of Star Trek fandom from deep in the heart of Texas, where we talk all about Star Trek all the time. And tonight, Dave and I are joined by a very special guest, someone I've really been looking forward to talking to, the one, the only, the great YouTube content creator, Jessie Gender. Jessie, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. I feel very honored by that intro. Thank you. I love it. And
I'm
137
very honored to have
episodes.
you here.
That's amazing. I didn't realize you've done that many.
Yeah, it's easy to do when you start doing weekly stuff. They add up fast. So we've,
A few of
especially
those
with
are
all the
just little-
shows, and
Just a little half-hour ones, and they barely count.
some of them are kind of short. But also sometimes we babble on for 2 hours. So
Correct.
Hey, it all counts. It all counts.
Right
it all
on.
adds up. Well, there's a lot to talk about. There's 55 years of history. There's over 800 episodes. So definitely lots of discussions to be had.
Yes, most definitely. Believe me, I know.
And today we're talking about a topic that I think for a lot of good reasons has been explored much more recently in Star Trek, but that is the LGBT representation in the franchise. And I'm glad to have you here to talk about that with us.
Yeah,
So
I'm glad to be here.
before we delve too deeply in that, though, I just want to ask a couple questions about yourself. Real quick, can you just tell us, how did you get into Star Trek?
I probably got into Star Trek I've told the story before, but it's the most roundabout and probably the worst way, either the worst way or the best way to get into Star Trek. So the way I got into it was my dad, my parents were divorced. So on the weekends, my mom would drop me off at a sort of a mid-between point between my dad and my mom's houses, and I would go to my dad's house, and it would take about 45 minutes. So my dad, when he picked me up one day, he would play audiobooks and radio stuff, and one day he just said, "Hey, I found this really cool audiobook that you're gonna love," and he played that on the way home, and it was the Star Trek Nemesis audiobook. And I'm like, I have no idea what's happening. I don't know who this Picard guy is, but I am so excited about this thing.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is spectacularly esoteric.
Exactly, right? It was so weird, and I got upset. I borrowed the audiobook from him, and I just listened to it over and over again. And then I, for Christmas that year, it was either Christmas or my birthday, I forget which, he got me the season 7 DVDs of The Next Generation. So I'm going weirdly backwards through Star Trek, but loved that, and then just sort of found more reruns and stuff on TV, and then eventually got into Star Trek Enterprise week to week, which was the show airing on at the time, and then and it just went from there. So
Cool. Yeah, I've heard you tell that story before, and I love it because you go
yeah,
from the Nemesis audiobook to season 7 of TNG
it's
to
so-
Enterprise.
I feel like among all the millions of Star Trek fans, that probably most people's stories repeat a lot among those. There's probably 10,000 people, 100,000 people who have my same story. There may be nobody who has your same story.
The Star Trek Nemesis. Hey, I've always said, it's probably the best way to get into it because they can only really go up from there. Starting with Nemesis. To be fair, the audiobook is honestly better than the movie in my opinion, but still, it's not a particularly great movie. So it's yeah, this is great, and if you think that's great, you're in for a ride.
The books have done a pretty good job of often being better than the movies.
Yeah, except for the motion picture, which might be sacrilegious considering Gene Roddenberry wrote it. But that book is fascinating look into his mind. But
It's definitely entertaining to read.
Oh, yes.
Let me ask you, were there any particular Star Trek characters or shows or episodes that really spoke to you? Like, what are some of your favorites that are out there?
I mean, this will probably tie into what we're discussing, but Dax, just overall, is one of my favorite characters. Quite for obvious reasons in terms of relating to me being a trans person and the obvious trill metaphor. But I also just loved Dax being this badass like woman kicking butt and just having this like very familiar friendship with the captain. And also recently, I didn't connect with her as much when I was younger, but now that I'm older, I have a weird. Like a much stronger appreciation for her, but Esri Dax too. Just having recently done a Deep Space Nine rewatch, I just adore her. But then also Seven of Nine as well. This is something that we probably won't touch upon, but a lot of the characters who are sort of like figuring out humanity and figuring out how to interact with other people and what it means to exist in sort of society. Always spoke to me. So Spock was definitely in there too, but Seven of Nine I think was the closest because I'm also on the autism spectrum as well. So that sort of like always just sort of like, yeah, I too also see humanity as this weird thing that I don't understand. So I get you. I get you, Seven of Nine.
That seems like a real, very much a trademark Star Trek kind of thing. Is the, a core core character in the ensemble who's the outsider. The Data or Spock, who gives a little bit of that outsider perspective looking in. And I think it's interesting that they, you can be non-specific in some ways with those characters, and yet draw in a pretty wide variety of people who feel on the outs at some point.
Exactly. And I like that they kind of each version of those types of characters, whether it's like Spock, Data, pretty much everybody in Deep Space Nine to a degree, and Seven of Nine, and a few others throughout all of Trek. They come at it from different angles and different desires of what they want to be human. Like Data, for example, is someone who wants to be human, but ultimately is kind of okay with the fact that he never will be, but he likes striving for it. Whereas Spock is someone who like actively rejects it. Whereas Seven of Nine is human, but sort of relearning what it means to exist as a human being. So there's always these different facets on that same sort of idea that I think is really interesting. And you can find different ways to hook into that sort of outsider mentality of like, where do you fit within even the outsiderness of it? And I think that, I mean, tying into what we're going to be talking about in just a little bit, like the outsider nature of a lot of the characters and a lot of Trek in general is probably what speaks to a lot of like marginalized minority communities, like the LGBTQ community.
Well, let me ask you more about that with characters other than Dax. Where in this 55-year history have you seen like other bits of LGBT representation showing up in Star Trek? I know it's not something that the franchise has traditionally handled in a great way, but have there been any moments that have like shown through over the decades?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like recent Star Trek shows, I think have done like Discovery and Picard, and hopefully even Lower Decks. It looks like if Mike McMahon's statements on how they're going to explore bisexuality in the show are to believe, even hints in that show. But with how they developed Seven of Nine, Stamets and Culber, and Nadira and Gray on Discovery, I think the way they've used those characters has been a mixed bag, but generally been trending towards positive, and I've been really, really pleased with how the show has really taken to heart the idea of IDIC. Like I honestly feel like modern Trek, for all the conversations and faults that it may have, has really just tried to strive to really live up to that ideal in a way that I don't think the French has ever done before. And we can get into that. But in terms of like through the decades, I think what's interesting about Star Trek throughout the years is, and this is just a statement as a franchise as a whole, but specifically on LGBTQ representation, is that it's always like tried to strive for that ideal of representing minority groups and trying to do things to show different aspects of societies and the LGBTQ community, but always failing at it in ways that are interesting, and I think provide really wonderful avenues for conversations in ways that I don't think other shows allow. Like, for example, The Outcast. is one of my personal favorite episodes of Star Trek, especially when talking about LGBTQ representation, which for those of you who may not remember, if you're listening to the podcast, The Outcast is the Next Generation episode where Riker, where the crew meets like sort of a genderless, non-binary race, and not to conflate non-binary with genderless, that's a whole other discussion, but within the show, that's sort of how they're described. And basically, we learned that one of these characters, Soren, I believe her name is, identifies as a woman, and her society does not accept her. And so they go through this whole process of discussing that. And that episode is so fascinating to me because when they wrote it, it was meant to be more of a sexuality metaphor. It was meant to talk about oppression of sexuality-based minorities, and sort of have that sort of discussion. And the idea of like a non-binary race was sort of this like, ooh, crazy idea, right? That would never happen in the real world. But because of how the episode is aged, the sexuality metaphor of it actually is a little bit outdated and doesn't get everything right. But if you rewatch it through the lens of a trans metaphor, which again, they might have been hitting on some stuff, but they didn't. I don't think that was the direct intention of the episode when they wrote it. It really actually feels very prescient to today. They talk about stuff with pronoun usage. They talk about stuff about identifying with genders other than your own. They talk about like what it means to be different genders and sexism within that and the fluidity of gender. And it's still not perfect, obviously, but I think that because the show just sort of has this sort of mindset of trying to be forward thinking, it both fails in ways and succeeds in ways that just create great avenues for conversation. So I think that episode is really wonderful. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, there's episodes like Cogenitor, which we could also talk about from Star Trek Enterprise, which has a similar idea of a third gender and honestly takes a very similar route, which, it kind of is like trying to talk about minorities and the oppression of minorities. But I think that episode, while it gets some stuff right, is ultimately fails in a lot of ways that weirdly The Outcast succeeds despite them being very similar episodes.
That episode of The Outcast is a weird one to me, just from my perspective on it, because watching that as a kid in rural Texas in the 90s when I caught like a rerun of it, but I hadn't really like heard people talk about gay people very much in life, and that was kind of the first time I ever saw something that was like, you know what, it's okay if people are gay. And so that was like kind of like the first time that idea was ever introduced to me. But then like years later, I'm like, oh, this is actually like a terrible representation of the gay community. And I was like, oh yeah, I can definitely see how that's dated and doesn't really apply anymore. But then it through a happy accident came back around, like you were saying, and now it's more of a story about gender. And so that's cool that that episode kind of it came in and out of the zeitgeist. So here's like a useful analogy for relevant social issues, and then it's not, but then it kind of is again. So it's interesting how that happened. It's cool when something can be redeemed like that.
I find that fascinating because that's what I love about this franchise is that there's so many lenses that you can look at the same episode through, because it is important to talk about, and I say this with like so many other things, but like it's important to talk about like even when something is quote unquote problematic, to overuse a generalized term, it can still be really important to saying something meaningful and pushing things forward. Like with the episode The Outcast, like it did, as you say, like teach people that may not have been exposed to that, like, oh, being gay is okay, and being gay is something that we should push for. That episode, for example, ends on this really terrifying and horrible note of sort of kind of like a bury your gaze metaphor, where the episode ends with her basically being brainwashed and losing her desire to be a woman, that's a whole gay conversion therapy thing that we could get into. That's also a big discussion as well. But that's such a sad note to end on, and is really a harmful kind of trope for LGBTQ people, because we never get to see ourselves have happy endings, and that can sort of perpetuate the stereotype of never getting happy endings. But on the flip side of that sad ending, it probably spurned a lot of people to feel bad about what happens to LGBTQ people and want to make sure that they don't do that in the real life. So it's it's so important to when we look at stuff like this to not be like, oh, thing is bad, thing is good, to be like, oh, there are good aspects of it, there are bad aspects of it, and what context does it sit in, and for who is it speaking to, and when is it speaking to. I think that's just really cool.
You know, I was thinking that Father, you were talking about how that episode, you know, prompted you a way of thinking, and I mean, I guess you know, Trek has pushed boundaries, but often with a sort of cis het audience in mind, and you know, often pretty successfully that way. But yeah, I think they, you know, just the input of like the LGBT community on it has either been sort of itself minimal or behind the scenes in a way that we kind of weren't aware of. But you know, I've mentioned this before. I think I grew up watching, you know, I'm a little older than you, so I grew up watching a TV show called Soap, which, you know, was a tongue-in-cheek spoof of soap operas, but also had sort of famously one of the first notable gay characters in TV. But they were played by Billy Crystal, and there are, in retrospect, actually many mistakes made, and some really, you know, huge conflations that shouldn't be in there. But I remember him as a sympathetic character when I didn't know anything about gay people growing up, and so and I was like, yeah, this just makes sense to me. Here are these, you know, he's clearly a good person. He's, you know, good people are friends with him and trying to protect him, and so yeah, why wouldn't I start to think along those lines too? But that's the approach from sort of a privileged cishet perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, like, it's, what do I want to say? I was trying to think of, I had a thought, but then it just sort of escaped me. But I think to a degree, like, all of this stuff should age. I feel like if shows don't age, that if they don't show their wear and tear over time, that means that there's kind of a problem. It's like, oh, society has not advanced forward, because these conversations are always ongoing, and they're hopefully always pushing forward. And I think that there's, to a degree, there's an element of things that it's almost a little bit of a sort of a melancholy feel that there's so much in, even going back to the original series, that speaks to today, because it shows how forward thinking and thoughtful that show was, even in its faults, like the sexism of the original series and even later shows as well. But it also sort of highlights, like, these are conversations that still need to be had today. And sort of going to your point of, like, the cis het audience, like, I think that it's such a difficult balance to walk, right? Because I feel like there are conversations that need to be had of, like, educating and teaching people who may not understand minority communities to like have a chance to learn, and kind of be expressly didactically told, like, this is what you should be doing, this is the lesson that you need to take away. And Star Trek's always good about being didactic in that way. But there is also a need for what I think shows like Star Trek Discovery are doing today, to just show us all being able to take part in that future and in that story and just be ourselves. And I feel like what Discovery does really well in terms of LGBTQ representation is it allows it not to just be targeted at a cishet audience, but allows everyone to sort of find places to see themselves in the story. And just by nature of existing within the story, you learn as well. Like, you learn what it means to have, like, we're seeing elements of this, what it means to have a found family, a found LGBTQ family, through the story of Stamets, Culber, Gray, and Adira, and sort of the love that they start to have for each other, despite the fact that they are not biological like family members, but they still feel that bond, or at least are starting to. And I think that that's just a natural part of the show as it's evolved, but it mirrors what happens so often in the LGBTQ community. And I think that that's really beautiful, and it doesn't beat you over the head with it, despite what some people may say. I think it just feels very natural, and it allows you to see that, and allows queer people to just feel like they're part of they get to be part of the world. And I think that's so important. But again, flipping back to it, like, sometimes there needs to be, sometimes we're said where it's like, hey, cishet white folks, you need to understand this, and you need to get this through your head, like, this is the thing that happens, and we need to do better about it. You can be better allies. This is something that actually expressly happens. So I'm glad that there's both conversations happening within the franchise itself, but that it also keeps pushing forward in things like Discovery.
I'm sure we can talk about this stuff more later, but I was thinking about how what was that episode? Is it The Outsider?
Outcast.
Outcast. Um, and you're talking about the ending, which kind of has a little bit of that, the bury your gaze or tragedy porn kind of vibe to it, which is sometimes how I guess we push forward, societally. But when I was watching that HBO show, was it Lovecraft Country?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I was aware that, like, became aware watching it, that every episode also had these sort of there was scary things happening to these people of color, but that it was also, there was a lot of celebration and black sort of joy as a sort of a backdrop to almost every episode, it seemed like. And I feel like that's something that's starting to be more common and more in disco and stuff like that, is to see some LGBT joy.
Yeah, no, that's so powerful. Like this is something that I've started to realize more and more, like how much it means to me to see moments of LGBTQ joy on shows, because you get so used to not seeing that. You get so used to just being like, all right, here's the token trans character, or here's this one moment, so that when you do see moments of like, oh, the trans character gets to be happy for once, she gets to take part and just be joyous and smile during a show, it hits you harder because you're just like, oh, I didn't realize that we could have that. And I'm so glad it's becoming more and more common today, but it still needs to be much more. Like, I remember sitting, I think it was like a few weeks ago, or I forget exactly what spurred it on, but I just remember thinking about, I think it was maybe when I was watching WandaVision, I'm like, the day that I get to see like a Marvel movie with a trans superhero at the front, I realize like, oh, in fact, I will cry at that, like just to get to see that, because I've never gotten that chance to just see a trans character do like a superhero landing in a big budget movie. And I got a piece of that in Supergirl with the character of Dreamer there. And that meant so much, but I just would like to see like a big screen, like billboard, as I drive through the city and see a trans superhero on there. And I'm glad that Star Trek is showing that. And it's interesting that you highlight Lovecraft Country, because it does have that sort of like black joy, but also the sort of darker aspects of it. And even in that show, there's some failures as well. And this kind of highlights some of the things that I was saying. There's a character who is a two-spirit character, which I am not Indigenous, so I don't want to fully speak for that community, but I know that it was really hard for the Indigenous community to watch a two-spirit character, which there are almost no two-spirit. For those of you who don't know, two-spirit is a sort of a type of trans identity within the Indigenous community that is unique to that community. Again, I'm not Indigenous, so I don't want to overspeak for that identity, but I do know that there were many two-spirit folks who were like, oh, we finally get to have a representation. And in that very same episode, they kill that character in a really kind of horrific way. And it was just like, oh, we finally have this moment. It's like, yes, you can get excited, and then you just see death, just a horrific death of that character. And it's just, that's what's really harmful about that sort of stuff, like bury your gaze trope, because it's like, oh, you get excited to see yourself, and then you just get told like, but you're only here to service the story and then die, to teach other people and for other people's arcs.
That's pretty brutal.
Yeah. So that highlights the problem with the Outcast, because it's like that episode was really necessary, as Fatheree, as you said. Like, it taught you stuff, but it was also hard for LGBTQ folks to watch that and be like, yay, I finally get to be in oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think part of that might be the creators of a lot of our entertainment tend to be, like Dave was saying, it's kind of like cishet creators making content for a cishet audience. But I think that has probably shifted in recent years as they've gotten more diversity behind the scenes, and that might be reasons why we are getting better at that. In Star Trek Discovery, for example, I think the showrunner, Michelle Paradise, I believe, is actually a queer woman, so she might be more aware of the importance of representation in media. And
yeah. And one of the ones one of the things that I like to point out, and I'm going to butcher his name because I don't remember off the top of my head, but one of the producers and a regular director on Star Trek Discovery, Osimund, I think is his last name. I forget it. I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but he's a regular producer and director on the show. And he's a black man, and he spoke about
Olatunde Osunmi is I think how you say his name.
Thank you so much. Yeah,
they call him Tunde.
Yes,
it's like his nickname.
Apologies to him for screwing up his name, but he spoke about in a podcast about how he works really hard to try and show diverse casting on the show. And hire, like, you know, even if it's like a background extra, hire like someone from a minority community that hasn't really been in Star Trek, whether it be someone from the disabled community or from India or things like that. And that just goes to speak to how, like, adding diverse people to your crew and to your cast begets more diversity, and it just sort of gets the ball rolling of people sort of thinking about adding different voices and adding different people instead of just having the room being all one identity. It just sort of keeps pushing it forward and forward and forward as the more voices you bring in. And I think that's really beautiful. It's like, as much as I love Ron and Braga, Ron Moore, Michael Piller, I think that, you know, they added some really great stuff to Star Trek. It is one of the sadnesses of the earlier shows of Star Trek that it was all just set white dudes writing about things that they didn't directly experience a lot of the time.
Yeah, it's funny. They had a bridge crew that was very diverse, but and sometimes of extras that were as well. But there was still a lot of white people. It was just, yeah. They were writing what they knew, and they themselves had some limited experiences despite being some forward thinkers.
Most definitely.
Well, last year we had an unprecedented 3 seasons of Star Trek in a single year. That never happened before. Next year we might actually have 5, so that's just kind of mind-blowing. But I just want to talk a little bit about some of the more recent stuff. We talked about Discovery a lot, but, you know, Discovery Season 3, they branch out with the new characters Adira and Gray. We also had Picard last year and some of the stuff that they were doing with 7 of 9 and Raffi, and then Lower Decks supposedly has queer characters on it, but I never picked that up on the show. Do you have any thoughts on those 3 seasons, kind of the 2020 Star Trek and stuff that we saw specifically last year?
Yeah, like many thoughts. Since we talked a lot about Discovery, I'll sort of hit on Picard and Lower Decks. Picard was interesting for me in a few ways, because there are things that I really liked and things that I really disliked about that season of the show in terms of an LGBTQ context. For example, Hugh, the character of Hugh, is 100% like the XBs in many ways are the X-Borgs. They feel very much like a minority-based metaphor. And sort of like talking about like PTSD and trauma, the collective trauma that many marginalized communities face about being like hurt in a collective way. And each person may have their own individual identity, but they share the same type of trauma and form their own kind of chosen family from that, kind of what Discovery hinted at. But I really like this idea of the XBs being that sort of like marginalized community that forms together based out of trauma and shared trauma, despite all having their own individual lives and experiences. And it's by no means lost on me that even though he was cast way back in The Next Generation, that Hugh is played by Jonathan Del Arco, who is a gay man, and specifically talked about in many interviews how he played Hugh as gay. And so I thought that was a really wonderful moment to sort of see a gay man leading that sort of metaphorical representation on the show. And I thought that was such a beautiful idea. And also the fact that 7 of 9 is part of this community, and they confirmed that she was canonically bisexual within the show, which I also think was wonderful and makes perfect sense for her character, because I'm a huge 7 of 9 Janeway shipper. So I was like, yes, it's still possible. So that's really wonderful, but it also really hurt because again, while Hugh was not explicitly gay in the show, which I do think is also a problem. I wish they had made him explicitly gay, but I'll talk about that sort of element of it with Lower Decks a little bit too, and how that can be good and bad. I was really hurt by the fact that they killed him in the first season of Picard. They killed off Hugh, which kind of made me feel echoes of Culber's death in the first season of Star Trek Discovery, where you just kind of what we already talked about, the bury your gaze thing, where it's like, oh, we get to exist in the show, but we always have to have a sad ending. And it was kind of made even worse. And this is sort of Picard was, I liked elements of Picard, but I did not like that show first season as a whole, though I am excited by its promise. I felt that they killed him and it didn't ultimately amount to much. It was just sort of like, oh, here's this, big dramatic moment for a big dramatic moment in the episode, and his death didn't really go much of anywhere, in my opinion. And so I was, yeah.
Dave hated that.
Yeah, no, it's awful. And I would just sort of wish that if he had died for something a little bit more in terms of the plot. But even so, I wish he hadn't died at all, because it was just hard to watch another gay man die in a franchise that, was supposed to be pushing to be IDIC, more diversity on the show. And they had already made that mistake and learned from it. Hopefully, I had thought, in Discovery. And yes, Picard has different writers, I understand, but it's still the same franchise. Like, they learned that killing Culber was a bad idea, and they brought him back, which I thought was great. And I think a good choice. But then to do it again, it's just like, ugh, frustrating.
I remember, and again, this coming from a cishet perspective, but that almost derailed me from Picard at the time. I was really upset about that, and I'd enjoyed watching those interviews with Jonathan Del Arco talking about it. And, some of it was also, I think he brought something to, the scenes just between he and Picard and stuff like that had brought a lot of kind of this warmth to the character. And I was enjoying seeing his progress and would love for him to become a recurring supporting character or something, someone who we check in with every once in a while.
Exactly. His scenes with Picard were some of the warmest things on the show. And like the moment where he hugs Picard was like, that was the best thing. I adored that.
Mm-hmm.
That was like the one big frustration. And then talking about 7 of 9, and this kind of gets me into Lower Decks too, because I think this element of it is a really interesting conversation of people got frustrated at the end of Picard, where there was sort of like a throwaway scene where 7 of 9 sort of is holding hands with Raffi, sort of confirming, and the showrunners confirmed this later on, that was to show that she is bisexual and that they were, going to start some sort of relationship, whether it ends up being official or not, or whatever, or long term or whatnot. But that was sort of a confirmation of that. And there was a lot of frustration in the LGBTQ community, which was like, oh, so you're just going to do that, but not like actually go all the way with it and actually show it on screen.
Right. It's like a little outro scene.
Yeah, and I see two sides of it, because it's hard to have that conversation with a show that's ongoing, and this brings me into Lower Decks in an interesting way, because Mike McMahon, who showruns Lower Decks, spoke about how in the next season of Lower Decks they're going to explore Mariner's bisexuality, that's going to be something that they sort of talk about and maybe even showcase in that season. And so it brings me to this interesting question of like, what we do want more explicit representation. We do want representation that it says like, look, this character is bisexual, because there's been so many times in history, in film and media where we can have queer characters, but they're queer coded. So it's like they may even be straight canonically within the story, but they're sort of like they sort of have these like stereotypes of gay people, or they give hints that characters are gay without actually saying it. I think of like Ben-Hur, for example, which that movie is intentionally gay, but they cannot say that within the movie itself, between the two lead characters, and to the point where even one actor was playing the character as explicitly gay, and the other actor did not feel comfortable with it and did not play it that way. So queer coding is such an interesting thing. So it's like we need to get to the point where we have more queer characters on the show, but I also think it's important to not sort of over highlight that fact and be like, hey, here's the gay character, here's the bi character, here's the trans character, let's beat you over the head with that right up front. And so I think there's an element of it that I think having Mariner in Lower Decks sort of exist within her own character and not necessarily deal with her sort of sexuality lets her be defined in other ways first, and then lets the sexuality sort of be a background element that informs her character but doesn't define her character. And I think that that's a really great way to do that. Now, I think that there's somebody who said about like leaving us hanging in that, because you can do that in ways that I think get to it a little bit sooner. possibly, and might avoid some of this frustration. Like I do think of Stamets in Discovery, where we meet him and we don't really know he's gay, other than the fact that he's played by Anthony Rapp. We don't really know that he's gay until several episodes after we meet his character, and it's sort of revealed that he's dating or married to Culber at that point. And so I kind of appreciate that, where it's like it's not right up front that he's gay, but it does show that within a few episodes time. And that could avoid the frustration that maybe we see with Seven of Nine and Mariner. But I think that, if season 2 of Picard and season 2 of Lower Decks come around and they sort of explore that in an interesting way, I think that that's totally forgivable in my mind. But if they just sort of use it as like a tokenistic thing of like, hey, look, Seven's bisexual, but next season she's totally gonna we're not gonna talk about that at all, I think that'll be a little bit more frustrating.
I was just thinking, I don't know much about the behind-the-scenes crew on Lower Decks, and if there's much diversity, like LGBT diversity in that mix or not. I really have no idea.
I think Mike McMahon said that he is trying to hire people like that on the show. When they were going from season 1 to season 2, because he admitted that he's not the best guy to be writing that type of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, some self-awareness, hopefully, then will lead to down better roads. Yeah.
It seemed to me almost like they might have realized that they were missing something in season 1 of Lower Decks, and now they're trying to kind of retroactively add some diversity, because I didn't see any hint of that with Mariner, even though that show did occasionally explore her sexuality. We see her have a holodeck program of like buff dudes working out. She was attracted to Ransom. She had dated a kind of like a 9/11 truther guy who thought Wolf 359 was an inside job. They had gone on a date at least. So she had like some clear attraction to male presenting characters, and it seems almost like they're trying to course correct now with that to make it more diverse.
Yeah, no, I agree. And here's the other thing too, is I hope that in season 2 of the show they don't do the bisexuality as kind of like a joke thing, which I've seen in other kind of sitcoms. I think one of the biggest examples of this is The Good Place, where you see in that show there's a constant jokes where I'm blanking on characters' names, but the lead character of the show constantly makes jokes about how she's attracted to one of the other female characters on the show, and it's just like a constant recurring joke, which I think is great. Like I appreciated that like a lot. Like I was all there for their like attraction to each other, and that it was sort of explicitly repeated. But it's often played as like the funny thing, and to a degree this isn't necessarily the intent, but to a degree where it's like, isn't it funny she's attracted to the girl? And is like being so blatant about it. And again, I know that that's not the intent, and I also appreciate that like they're showing bisexuality in a positive light, but there is an element of that. So I hope
a novelty presentation.
Yeah, and so I hope that if they do show Mariner's bisexuality, I don't mind her having like jokes about like, hey, I'm attracted to this girl, like they have with the guys on the joke where she has like the all male sex gym that she has, like that. The joke is like, haha, look at her like attracted to a bunch of dudes. So I don't mind it being the case, but I would like to see her dating both men and women, or non-binary characters of all sort of gender presentations. I think would be nice to see, and then you could still have those types of jokes.
Right. I suppose the ideal would be she's dating a woman, but the idea is that this woman is a Wolf 359 truther.
Yes. Oh my gosh. To be fair to the Wolf 359 truthers out there, it was an inside job to a degree.
Yeah.
It was a Starfleet officer.
They did have Picard.
I don't want to go down that path.
Yeah. No. Like confirming conspiracy people.
There are like conspiracies in fiction, like can be like so fun. This is just a very small segue, but like in the 90s and X-Files and all that other stuff, it seemed so fun. And then Alex Jones became big, and then the 9/11 truthers, and suddenly conspiracy stuff ceased to be a fun fiction prompt, and it was a scary thing in our real world.
Especially the last couple of years, it's gotten even worse.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that is That is very true. And this is a tangent, but yeah, Star Trek has sort of leaned into that a little bit in a way that I'm like, I hope they get away from, like with Picard season 1, where it's like, oh, there's the secret cabal conspiracy of the even more secret police of the Romulans that were technically all real.
That is true. That'd be an interesting topic for discussion some other time, is the conspiracy metaphor, and how it can work. Is it's a very fun fictional element. It's all these who can you trust storylines, but there it does kind of infiltrate our brains a little bit, and we start thinking it's like, oh, maybe so,
Yeah. I will say that Star Trek does it well in the Voyager conspiracy, but I did a video on that to self promote, I guess.
That was a good video. The other thing with the bisexuality being represented in Star Trek that I think I've heard people criticize before is with the mirror universe. How it's often shown to like be an indicator that someone is kind of morally ambiguous, and so they're kind of like sexually ambiguous.
Yeah, I mean that is a common trope within a lot of fiction too, where it's like, oh, we get to have bisexuality, but it's like, oh, it's because you're promiscuous, and promiscuity is sort of a negatively coded trait. So they're evil, and so it's sort of way to highlight their moral dubiousness, which is very frustrating, because number one, being promiscuous is not a negative or positive thing. Being promiscuous is just something someone can be. There's no judgment from me on that, as long as you're doing it with consenting adults and not hurting anybody. And then also like just coding bisexuality in general of like, oh, you're morally gray, you don't know which side to pick. That sort of feeds into that thing of bisexuality as being like, they can't just decide. They're not one or the other. They're not straight or gay. They're just sort of this in between, like not choosing sort of thing, which is kind of just harmful to, like, it sort of erases bisexuality to a degree by leaning into that trope. And it was also, this is another area where Discovery, in my mind, fails to a degree in terms of bisexual representation, because they do show Empress Georgiou being bisexual. And it also like weirdly implied, again, unintentionally. I don't think that the writers of the show did this intentionally, but it kind of may speak to the lack of bisexual writers on the show, at least at the time when they wrote that. There's that scene in season 2 of Discovery, which the Empress Georgiou sort of talks with Stamets and Culber, and she comes down and starts hitting on Stamets, and Stamets like, hey, I'm gay. And she says, Empress Georgiou said, oh, stop being so binary. The Stamets in my universe was pansexual. And it sort of like leads to this weird implication of like, oh, so being pansexual or bisexual or anything like that is a choice, because everything else about like different universes is the same but like his sexuality is different because of how he was raised to be more evil or whatever. It has one of those like unfortunate implications that I don't think they fully thought through when they wrote a scene like that, and it's just kind of ultimately frustrating, perpetuates stereotypes about bisexuality in general.
Yeah, it almost kind of suggests to me, and if you look at like Deep Space Nine also, but it almost kind of suggests that maybe everyone in the mirror universe is pansexual, and so that's kind of problematic too. If you're gonna have like, okay, the evil universe is like the all pansexual universe.
Yeah, I mean, there is an element of, I think, like, I think there is, this is my personal belief and sort of thing. I do think there's an element of like, I think we all are a little bit more if we sort of release the confines of what society tells us have to be, we would all probably be a little bit more fluid in our sexuality than we would perhaps admit to ourselves, because society tells us we have to be rigidly this thing or another. Now, I'm not saying everyone would be 100% bisexual if society didn't exist, but I feel like we would allow ourselves a little bit more flexibility in exploring that and showing that. And so I wish, I mean, it would be a hard line to walk for exactly the reason that I've sort of stated, that it's like, you don't want to necessarily say like everyone would be bisexual in the future, because I don't think that's true. But it would be nice to see in the regular Prime universe of Star Trek sort of saying like, oh, there's a little bit more willingness to explore those elements of your identity and not necessarily judge it and be like, hey, I'm 100% straight, but I slept with all different genders in many ways, and just to sort of see what I felt comfortable with, which we don't really allow ourselves in today's society. And to a degree, like, I don't hate that part of the mirror universe, but I just hate that it's only coded in sort of evil ways. But this also goes back into like the long history of LGBTQ representation in media, because it goes back to that queer coding idea of you could have queer characters in media coming out of the Hays Code. Like the Hays Code said you couldn't show what was called sexual deviancy, and this was sort of like a censorship code, a moral censorship code that was put on.
Can you explain that
Hollywood.
a little bit more, because I think a lot of people have never heard of that.
Yeah, there was this code that was sort of created. There was obviously this sort of like moral panic when movies started to get really popular, and sort of there was like a lot of Christian groups and other groups that were sort of like saying like, oh, movies are going to perpetuate moral deviancy in our society, and people often forget, like at that time, that gay representation in film and LGBTQ representation in film was actually a bit more accepted. Like Wings, for example, which was a Best Picture winner, one of the first, I think it might have been the first Best Picture winner, Oscar winner, had a gay kiss in it. So that was actually part of Hollywood's history for right since the beginning.
And that was like the 1920s?
Yeah, exactly. And so because of that, the Hays Code sort of was implemented by like Christian groups that sort of said like, either you're going to adhere to this code. And it sort of had like a lot of different weird rules to it. Like you couldn't show racial, like cross-racial relationships, which is also horrible for its own reasons, but pertaining to our own topic here, and also things like you couldn't show criminals like succeeding, and same thing with gay characters. So you couldn't show gay characters because it would be like promoting this deviant lifestyle. And so what writers eventually learned and learned to do was that, because there were many gay writers and LGBTQ writers writing in Hollywood at the time, they learned to do is like, well, we can kind of have LGBTQ characters. We can kind of show them in a way, but we, number one, can't really make it totally explicit. And if we get really close to having it be explicit, or even if we do show it explicit, we have to punish those characters by the end of the film. So they have to usually die or be blocked away or be shown to be insane or something like that, usually death. And that's sort of like, that sort of created that bury your gays trope, which was like, it came out of the Hays Code, writers under the Hays Code wanting to be like, look, we want to have LGBTQ characters in this story in some way because we want to represent ourselves, but this is the only way we can do it. But because that was sort of like the trope that started to get perpetuated, that gay characters had to be killed, even when the Hays Code went away after many, many years, that trope stuck around. And so it sort of led to many gay characters being shown to be villains, shown to be evil, shown to get the sad ending. And that just has stuck with us all the way until today. Even though the rules no longer apply, that sort of thinking still exists. And so that's sort of what led to that perpetuation. And leading into what we were talking about with the mirror universe, it's sort of leaning almost directly into that idea of like, oh, we can have our gay characters, but they need to be evil. They need to be punished. They need to be shown to be wrong. Whether or not that was the implication or the intention of the writers, they are leaning into that harmful trope. So,
well, they have finally redeemed our mirror universe character, and maybe someday we'll get to see her be a hero of a Star Trek show, and we'll have, like, I guess that would make her the first queer protagonist in a Star Trek show. Well, I guess Mariner. Who's the protagonist of Lower Decks? Is it Mariner or Boimler? It's kind of an ensemble thing, right?
Yeah, you could argue between the two. I would probably make the argument that it's Mariner, but you could make a solid case for Boimler too.
I mean, I guess they're all protagonists, but you're talking about like leads, right?
Or I'm sorry, like the main character.
Yeah, I know. I do what you meant.
Yeah.
But speaking of that, possible Section 31 show someday, it got kind of backburnered. But we are getting Strange New Worlds. We are getting Prodigy. We have more Picard, Lower Decks, Discovery coming down the pike. The sky's the limit. They could do anything with 5 shows. I feel like they're going to have room for just about any idea they can think of. What would you like to see them do next in these shows, specifically as to how to perhaps better represent the LGBT community?
I think number one, like you said, have non-binary or sorry, let me rephrase, have LGBTQ characters be the leads of shows. Like have a LGBTQ character be a captain of whatever show comes up next. I think that would be amazing. I also feel like we can do better about showing different intersections of LGBTQ identity, I think, in interesting ways. Like, I think both Gray and Culber are people of color, and I would kind of find it interesting just maybe explore those sides of those characters as well, and how, like, you can talk about what it means to be a Black LGBTQ person. This is, as I'm not a person of color myself, but I think that would sort of be something that we should explore more about, the infinite diversity and infinite combinations of. Because one of the things that I like about Discovery is there's not just one gay character on the show, so you don't have to and same thing with the trans characters. There are two trans characters, one being non-binary, one more binary identified, but there are two trans characters on the show, and so they're showing multifacets, and both characters don't have to define a whole community within the show. But I would also like to show what makes them unique within their own selves and their own identities. So I think exploring what it means to be, non-binary within Gray, or maybe show another non-binary character as well, to show the diversity within the non-binary community itself, to show what it means to also be, like I said, person of color, to be a Black gay man, to be a non-binary person of Asian descent, with Gray. I think that would just be really, really cool to just see more of those aspects within it. And then, like I said, a lead LGBTQ character would be freaking amazing. I mean, give me a trans captain, and I will also, like I said, the day that we get a trans captain as the lead of a Star Trek show, or even as a prominent character, I will probably bawl again just as much as I did when I saw Adira and Gray. So
Get a trans captain who can also, when they're not shooting the Star Trek show, that actor can go be the main character in a MCU Marvel movie.
Yes, exactly. I would probably faint at that point.
The Star Trek and the Marvel movies have had their crossover actors, so it's precedent. I think that somewhat the ball is in Marvel's court on that one.
What, you don't think DC's gonna?
No, Marvel we know has the Chinese market and their limitations on it, and how much they're going to be willing to buck that trend, is something I couldn't guess.
Yeah. Disney likes that China box office money.
Oh, yes, they do. Unfortunately,
but it does seem like when we started seeing a little bit more diversity in Discovery, I remember like noticing it and thinking, Star Trek feels like it's a little late to the party on this. Like, they really should have been pushing harder earlier. I don't know if maybe like Enterprise was a step back, or
Enterprise was the missed opportunity.
Yeah.
Because I thought that at the time. We had like Willow on Buffy at the same time that we had Enterprise. I remember thinking that back then. Like, why isn't Enterprise doing this?
Yeah, I mean, it speaks to the fact that I feel like, they talk about franchise fatigue with Enterprise, and this is coming from an Enterprise fan, but I feel like the problem with Enterprise was just that it was just a show, but from the same people. It was like the fourth show from the same people who have been doing it for 20 years. And I feel like Star Trek too have gone forward and needed to have different people at the helm. Like, I think we still could have seen more shows, and I feel like they just kind of got stuck in doing the same thing over and over again. And speaking to the sort of LGBTQ aspect of it, I feel like we really can't have this conversation fully without talking about someone like Rick Berman, and his sort of really kind of like, he was not a great guy. I mean, there are elements of like, I'm aware that he helped shepherd the series, and there's an element of like, we could not have had all of Star Trek without him to a degree. But I feel like Star Trek failed in so many aspects, in sort of its perpetuating sexism, its lack of LGBTQ representation. A lot of that comes down to him and his decisions to not want to showcase that. And again, not all on his feet, but he definitely was one of the lead instigators of that, without getting too sort of dark and dreary with that. But I also should say there are other people that I think probably could have pushed a little bit harder to again, not condemn, but just to sort of point to the fact, like, this is where people failed. I remember seeing Ira Stephen Bear in the Star Trek Deep Space Nine documentary. He pointed out the fact that, like, look, we all knew Garak was gay on Deep Space Nine. We all knew that he was being played that way. And we could have tried to make him gay, but we never even asked. And yes, the answer might have been no, And that maybe speaks to the culture that Rick Berman sort of engendered on that franchise, that sort of like it presumed that the answer would be no. But it also is somewhat saddening that someone like Ira Steven Behr, and he fully admits this, did not even ask or try to really push that aspect of it. So it's like, if what I am appreciative of modern day Trek is that, like, even when they fail, and where they do fail, they seem to be listening to the criticism and listening to and being willing to step up to the plate to try and do it again, and not hide from their failures, but say like, okay, we failed, and let's try and move forward. Whereas, you know, back in the day with older shows, I feel like they failed in that aspect. Yeah. So.
You know, I think Culber is like a particularly clear example of addressing a problem and really fixing it in a really nice way, so that he returned. And you know, honestly, I was a little worried that it was going to be a little bit of a sort of prosaic relationship and that there wouldn't be much to it. But they found this role for him in season 3.
Yeah.
That's it. I think he's really emerged as a strong character, and it's a good example of what you can do if you course correct. I guess right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He might have been my favorite character in season 3. Like I can't think of a single scene he was in that I didn't love that entire season.
Wilson Cruz like brought it that season. He really made. It's just funny to me because my one criticism of, because I agree with you, I loved his character. Like, dude just needs to take an official counselor role. He just really should be a counselor. But yeah, no, I think that's really wonderful, honestly. Like, I feel like too often when things get criticized on franchises and shows like this, the writer's impetus is to be like, oh no, we screwed up, we won't do that again, you know, and sort of like hide away from the fact that they failed and don't really step up to the plate again. But I give the writers of Discovery and the Trek shows credit that they're willing to be like, yeah, we screwed up, we're going to step up and we're going to try and fix it as best we can and take the criticism and move forward. And that's honestly a really admirable trait that I do want to give them heavy credit for, because that's a hard thing to do. It's a really hard thing to do, to admit mistakes and try to move forward from that in a constructive way.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I haven't heard anyone else point that out yet, but you're absolutely right. And they do deserve credit on that front. Jessie, I want to thank you again for taking the time to speak with us today. I don't want to eat up too much of your time. We're just real quick, is there anything in particular out of these shows, just to ask kind of a fun question to end things on, with Picard Season 2, Strange New World Season 1, Discovery Season 4, Prodigy Season 1, Lower Deck Season 2, all this stuff. I can't believe that's so much. Don't
forget possibly Short Trek Season 3. Come on. Don't forget the Short
Treks. I think we kind of don't need them anymore, but hey, maybe. Oh, and maybe this Kalinda Vasquez written Star Trek movie. Out of all of these things, though, is there one that just really stands out to you as the one you're really looking forward to the most?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, honestly, surprisingly, I am very excited for Prodigy. I'm actually super excited to see what that show does, because I feel like that's a show that's going to be doing something that we've never really seen Star Trek do before, like Lower Decks before it, which was like have an animated Star Trek show that's aimed expressly at kids, because even the animated series was kind of still aimed at adults, like the old animated series. And so I think that like doing that in that style will be super interesting and fascinating to see what they do with it. And I think it'll be a good way to sort of create a new entry point for younger Star Trek fans to come into the franchise and find the joy that we all found with it. Because Star Trek, I think, has had several problems throughout its entire 55-year history, is that it sometimes gets a little bit too insular and it's harder to bring people into it. And it can be done with people sort of like being like, hey, come watch the show, like parents bringing kids into it or friends and things like that. But I think having an entry point that people can find naturally at a young age and sort of like making it easier for them to find that natural entry point, I think will be really beautiful.
Instead of the Nemesis audiobook.
Yes, better than the Nemesis audiobook.
You know, but you can't discount the results it had, I guess.
Yeah, no, it worked.
Look at you now.
But to speak to your point, I think sometimes Star Trek has been kind of mom and dad's show sometimes, and kids either get into it or they don't, but it does kind of still feel like you're getting in on something that's made for the parents, and this is made for you story. So
yeah. I mean, there's somebody who said like, "Oh, I get to share something with mom and dad," but there's also somebody who said about like, "Hey, I found this cool thing on my own," which I think will be just an interesting to see. Plus, I think children's animation. I just finished watching Gravity Falls and She-Ra recently, and I think that children's animation is actually a really, to use a phrase, new frontier to really explore in all of television storytelling today, and it's cool to see Star Trek sort of entering into that.
Yeah, I just in a few months ago watched that first season of She-Ra and really liked it. And obviously Avatar and stuff like that were very much on my mind too when they announced Prodigy.
Well, that's
I'm
what they
excited
compare
to see
it
the
to.
first trailer.
They keep comparing Prodigy to like Avatar, The Last Airbender, or Legend of Korra. So I think that's what they're aiming for. Even like the CEO or some higher up at Nickelodeon says like, yeah, we want to hit like that niche nerd fan base that like loves Avatar. Like that's what we're trying to do with Prodigy.
Yeah, and the other thing too is I feel like this is getting off on a tangent, but I feel like children's animation is actually a weirdly perfect fit for Star Trek, because Star Trek has always been a very didactic show about like, let's teach you lessons about the world. And most children's shows also, like when in the pitch doc for most children's shows, it's sort of like, here's our learning goals for this show. And so I feel like having sort of marrying Star Trek with the children's sort of genre, which is all about also teaching lessons to kids, I think that weirdly just fits perfectly.
Well, to sort of tie Prodigy into the broader topic here, it will be interesting to see where they land on it, because you got She-Ra, which I've only seen the first season, but I know like had pretty strong LGBT representation throughout, and themes that ran throughout it. But then you also have something like Korra, which I have not seen Korra actually yet, but I understand kind of held out to the very end before dabbling at all, and so there is a question of will Prodigy be able to live up to Star Trek's promise of infinite diversity and infinite combinations?
Well, judging from everything that we've seen with modern Trek, I have every faith that they will. I have faith of the heart, as it were, that they'll do it well.
The Enterprise, fandom never leaves.
Exactly. Hey, I got my Star Trek Enterprise action figures right next to me over there.
Nice.
Oh, the Art Asylum line.
Yep, I have a decent chunk of them. So
yeah, those were pretty good, highly detailed. Jesse, I just want to say thank you one last time, and I love your content so much. I think you're very talented at making like really good, well thought out stuff, and you also have a unique voice that I'm so happy you were able to build a platform and get your voice out there. I enjoy your stuff so much that I can even forgive you for kind of helping to normalize this idea that Faith of the Heart is a good song, which I miss the old days when just it was universally hated. But I mean, hey, it's the times
I've been
are
having
changing.
this battle with Fatheree since we started the show, and eventually I'll have to kill him. But for right now, there's a détente.
Well, first off, let me say thank you so much for your kind words. I really, really appreciate that. But also, Faith of the Heart is a baller song. It slaps so hard. So you're wrong. You're wrong, Fatheree. I'm with you, Dave, all the way.
Okay, I'm not.
I send Fatheree the memes that I send Fatheree Faith of the Heart memes to hurt him.
I love it. I love it.
Well, thank you everyone in our audience for listening or watching us, and be sure to come back soon, because Dave and I are going to be revisiting some Deep Space Nine as we wait for more Star Trek to come out. Hopefully we'll have Anna back on the show, who's talked Trek with us before, and we're going to be returning to Deep Space Nine for DS9 Season 2.
Awesome.
And can I ask, I don't know if I caught Jesse, what's the name of your podcast again?
The podcast that I do with Council of Geeks is called What the Frel. So it's a it's a Farscape rewatch podcast, because I've never seen Farscape, and so I'm going through with Council of Geeks who has seen every episode. So it's sort of that dual perspective. Yeah, it's fun.
Very awesome.
Yeah, so everyone should check that out if you're into Farscape, and of course, subscribe to Jesse's channel on YouTube. It is some of the best Star Trek content being made on the internet right now.
Oh, well, thank you.
And until next time, as always, live long and prosper, y'all.
Listen to the Tex-Trek podcast through Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or at tex-trek.com. Like us on Facebook at facebook.com/tex-trek, and follow Fatheree on Twitter at TXTrek. Please support us by liking our videos and subscribing to our channel on YouTube. Thank you and take care.